Hello, it is July 6th, 2020. We're still in a bit of a COVID quarantine, and today I'm going to make use of my very well-worn copy of Rombauer's Joy of Cooking to make what they call quick banana bread. Quick banana bread. Here's the recipe for quick banana bread. Whoop. And as typical of Rombauer, the the recipe is very brief. You know, they don't waste a lot of space in providing you with the recipe, but they've got a lot of recipes as a result, and in their volume. Now, there's also a lot of space within that format for what really is probably the one of the most important features of cooking, which is improvisation. And kind of doing things to taste. Now that's a little bit less true of baking, but still there is some space for improv in this. Now this is going to involve bananas, and specifically ripe bananas, and that's why I'm making this as much as anything else, because we got a lot of ripe bananas. Now at the moment the outdoor temperature is 90 degrees and the heat index brings that up to 99. It may have risen a little bit since I last checked, but it's very warm outside, so I hesitate to start up the oven, and yet it's going to be hard to do this without baking. Fortunately, this requires a low baking temperature of 350 degrees, so it's not going to heat up the house too much. It's a fairly well insulated stove, but it does get warm around here. I use a very large bowl when I'm mixing batter for this recipe, because I usually make a double batch. So a large bowl is useful. Bananas. This particular recipe from Rombauer, if you paused and looked at that, calls for lemon, and someone has decided that a bit of end of garlic needed to go in there, but I've got a very little bit of dried lemon, and so I'm going to prepare some lemon rind. And another thing that this recipe calls for is, I think actually the recipe calls for pecans, which I do not have. It just says nut meats, and you can also use apricots. I use walnuts. So to prepare the walnuts, start with that, because they're kind of dry ingredient. I always find that if I chop up walnuts, I can always find some application for them. I put them on salads. They're pretty good all-round item. And actually, I think I'm going to want a little bit more than this. I use a chef knife for this type of work. You can use like a Chinese cleaver, and got my fingers back. From the meats, I'm just kind of feeding them through. this is actually a pretty open kitchen design, but it's hard to find a place for the camera. So if this isn't easy to see, I apologize for that. Now I like to get the meats down so that they're really not exactly a powder, but where they're definitely small and so that was a pretty quick operation. Now you can do this same sort of thing with peanuts, you know, to render them down into a small small size. Okay, so the recipe calls for ½ a cup. And that's a ½ cup of dry measure, and I've got these little measuring cups that I use for dry measure, and then I use these type of cups for liquid measure. I came pretty close, but that's not quite ½ cup. And actually I'm going to double the recipe, so just keep at it until I'm close here. I happen to like this cutting board. I guess at this point it's more nostalgia than anything else, but unhappily it is warped this way, so the deep part is where I'm working on it, and I guess it is time to get a new one. Cutting boards are remarkable, like knives, like just about anything that you can think of. There's controversy around it. I don't think it gets to fisticuffs too much, but there's a lot of diversity of opinion on cutting boards. I happen to like wood ones. It's probably an aesthetic thing more than anything else. They do require some care and cleaning, but so do plastic ones. So do, I guess some people are using like some kind of glass. I don't know. I wouldn't use that. I wouldn't recommend that. All right, so that's a ½ cup of meats. Walnut meats. And again, I'm not quite there. It's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination to have in terms of this recipe, the apricots, dried apricots, and the nut meats are considered to be optional, and so you can be a little flexible, and particularly because you could put in both the nut meats and the apricots. You know, you can see that they're kind of, so to speak, floating in the matrix of the cake. What you do have to get right proportionately is the flour, the eggs, the sugar, the leavening. Now the eggs are doing part of your leavening in this instance. Eggs are often really a kind of they become a rising agent, particularly when combined with other things. And that, I would say, maybe a tablespoon and a half. I'm just going to add that in too. Yeah, now one thing that I generally do is I clean up all through the process, and I will often put things back, you know, to their starting point, even in the middle of the process. Partly because I've got limited space here. When I first moved in, I did not have a microwave, partly because, well, I did actually have a microwave, but I didn't have it out on the counter because it took up a lot of space. So I had the microwave in the utility cabinet, but the people that I live with now use the microwave a lot, so we have it out on the counter. Okay, lemon. The recipe calls for 3/4 of a teaspoon of grated lemon rind. And I do have about a quarter teaspoon of dried lemon rind, and I'm going to prepare some more. And over here in the Lazy Susan cabinet, I've got a variety of things, including grater. I'm going to use this side portion, and I like these lemons that have the little nipples on them because they grate very nicely. And then those gratings are down the side here, so I pull those off. And I think I'm getting pretty close to what the recipe calls for. Okay, so this is a quarter teaspoon. That's a quarter teaspoon of the dried stuff. I've got about a quarter teaspoon of fresh. I need another quarter teaspoon for one time through of the recipe. I'm doubling the recipe, so I'm actually going to need 6/4 or 1.5 teaspoons So now I have enough for, that's one batch, you know, or the recipe once over. It's a little bit light, but that's the first of the 3/4 teaspoons for the second batch. I'm going to do them all together, so it's really one batch, but it's a double-sized batch from the recipe. And I got to keep reminding myself of that, because otherwise I'm going to measure out things and I'm not going to have enough. One thing I often do when I make this recipe is I forget to put in the nut meats. And those kinds of errors occur mostly when you don't set everything out to begin with. And again, there's a little extra lemon, and I'm just gonna take the little extra lemon and put that in there. So this is enough nut meats for a doubled recipe. This is enough lemon for a doubled recipe. And now it's going to be harder for me to demo my my banana trick, but I'll come back to that. The background music, for anyone who's interested, is Bombay Dub Orchestra, music from the Grand Bazaar, and that beeping means that the oven is ready. Okay. Now, another thing that's needed for this recipe is this recipe just uses baking powder. I have another recipe that's kind of similar for banana zucchini bread that uses both baking powder and baking soda. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but baking powder, when baking, it is very important to read carefully whether you're using baking soda or baking powder. It makes a big difference. I made a recipe once and I was like, oh, this is the most horrible thing that I've ever eaten, and it was because the recipe called for baking powder and I read that as baking soda. It was one of the first times that I made a recipe that didn't use yeast. Okay, so I need 2 1/4 teaspoons for each recipe, or a total of 4 1/2 teaspoons. So I'm going to use the teaspoon. This is actually a teaspoon of measure, and very conveniently, most baking powders will provide you with a little scratching thing here, or where you can level them off. A scratching thing, I think that's actually what it's called. And so that's the teaspoons, and now I need a 1/2 teaspoon to finish off the recipe. Now that looks like a lot of baking powder, but that's the primary leavener. Now a leavener is just what makes the bread rise. Okay, and together with that, there's going to be the other elements of the rising are going to be the sugar, but also salt. And the recipe calls for 1/2 teaspoon of salt. We're going to increase that, or I'm going to increase that to 1 teaspoon, and I'm going to put it right in here with this, with the baking powder. And I'm actually going to stir those up together. Now, already you have to realize that in baking from scratch, there's the baking time, but there's also prep time, and that involves various types of measurements, and I'm going to illustrate some of that now. I mean, I'm already showing you measurements. Flour, sometimes a recipe will not specify that it should be sifted, but if you are dealing with a recipe that does call for the stuff to be sifted, a device like this is very useful. Now, there is nothing grand about the flour that we use. I don't keep it under special conditions. It's really just unbleached, enriched, all-purpose wheat flour. For this recipe, we will need, the recipe calls for 1 3/4 cups. So we will need 3 1/2 cups. Now let me just, okay, 1.75 times 2 is 3.5, yes, okay, so 3 1/2 cups. And once again, this is dry measure, so I'll use a 1/2 cup. Okay, 3 1/2 cups is 7 1/2 cups. And I want to sift this before I measure it for the recipe. So this gets to be a little fussy, and I think this is where some people balk at the whole issue of cooking by scratch. You know, it's this sort of thing that I'm doing right here. All right, now there are other types of sieves. South Asian people seem to be very fond of what I would call a riddle. It's a different sort of device than this. And sometimes fancy households, and I guess people who do a lot of baking, you know, kind of will move in that direction of the riddle type sieve, and have multiple sieves of different sizes. Okay, so that's 1, 2. Now, I just found from experience with this particular recipe that I can be somewhat approximate in terms of leveling the cups. But I didn't get quite to 3, and I need 7 altogether. So this is where it's important to, you know, kind of try to keep track of these things. Sometimes I find myself measuring more than once because I can't remember whether I did it or not. Now I'll just shake that down to level, but some people would, you know, use some brush across it to make sure that it was super level. Okay, so that's 3. 6. Getting really close here. So that's 7. And that, I consider that to be sifted. And we're not doing, this is a batter. This makes a batter. So some types of baking, you know, you're making things that are needed. This is poured into the pans. So it's a different sort of situation. Now, I've ended up using two bowls because of the sifting, and the recipe calls for the leavening agents to be sifted in with the flour. So these are the leavening ingredients. It's the baking powder and the salt. And I'm going to re-sift that into here. This is just, I guess I'm not really helping the process by just dumping it in there, but you're trying to blend the flour and the leavening agent. Now there are a number of other ingredients. Haven't gotten to the bananas yet, but they're part of this. So here we've got the flour mixed with the baking soda and salt for 2 batches or 2 times the recipe. The nut meats, the lemon. Okay, so we need a 1/3 cup of shortening, and controversy attends what to do with sifters, and I actually do wash them, which some people consider to be complete sacrilege, but I'm going to set that to the side for the moment. We need a 1/3 cup of shortening for the recipe, so 2/3 of a cup of shortening. And what I've been using as shortening for this recipe, which, you know, I guess is to give it a sort of tropical whatever, I've been using coconut oil. And that gets to be a little challenging when the temperatures are where they are, because coconut oil becomes liquid right about the room temperature right now. Try to keep the house at not too much, you know, like 10 degrees below the outside temperature with the AC. Okay, so that's the shortening. And now, as often happens in preparing these kinds of things, I've realized that the recipe calls for all the ingredients to be at about 70 degrees. And one of the ingredients is eggs. And I have eggs that are in the refrigerator. I haven't taken them out yet. The recipe calls for 1 or 2 eggs. And then there's the whole question of what is an egg in terms of size. And these are listed as being mediums, but they're smaller than what we often use in our household, which are jumbos or extra larges. And I'm going to be daring and use 4 of them. And while they warm up a little bit, I'm going to show my banana method of dealing with bananas. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to get out the sugar, because otherwise I'm very likely to forget that I got to get the sugar out, and that would be a mess. So we've got 2 times the 1/3 shortening, and we're going to need a total of 4/3 cups, or 1 1/3 cups of sugar. And for this particular recipe, I like to use brown sugar, and I just realized that I think I do have enough for it, but I may not have quite enough. So I'm going to loosen up the sugar so it doesn't come out in lumps. And because I was foolish enough to measure the shortening before I measured the sugar, I'm going to have to be a little careful. Alright. So that's 1. Here I'm doing all these things that I've said not to do. You got to measure very carefully, and I'm just spilling this sugar all over the place. Sugar is often important to the leavening process, or to the, maybe I shouldn't say leavening, but to the rising process. So I'm not really sure how that is, whether that is so when you're using baking powder, but certainly when you're using yeast. Okay. One more and we'll say that we've endured this episode in our lives here. so thank goodness that's over. Got the sugar in there. Now this needs to be blended in with the eggs. The eggs are not yet warmed up. So on to the bananas. Okay, now, one fun thing that you can do with bananas when they're very ripe, instead of trying to peel them, and because in this particular case we're going to mash them, so what I do is I mash them in the what do you call it, in the peel. And I just squeeze them out. Sometimes you can squeeze them from the end, which is a lot of fun. These are very ripe bananas, so these are a little bit less ripe, but they're still. Now the recipe calls for, I believe, a cup. It says 1 to 1 1/4 cups of ripe bananas. And I actually sort of break my usual practice here because there's enough of them that I tend to put them in a glass measuring cup that I'm typically using for liquid measure, but I'm not too worried about the final measure. And now in terms of mashing them, I suppose you could use all kinds of different things. I find that a rounded wooden spoon works pretty well. Any remaining peel you want to get out. And really want to get them so that they are almost like a liquid, which isn't difficult usually. If they're really very ripe, they'll do this very quickly. And so maybe about 2.5 cups. And with this, as with the nut meats and the lemon, you can kind of do it to like however much you've got, because the main part of the batter is the flour and the sugar and the eggs and the baking powder and the salt and the sugar. But it looks like I'm going to be able to use up all these bananas, which is great. Now, in our temperate, we live in Pennsylvania, and that is, you know, a temperate climate, but all these banana peels go into our compost. Some people don't like putting citrus rinds or banana peels in their compost, but I certainly put them right in there and they break down. Bananas, walnuts, lemon. The lemon actually is going to get mixed in with the flour mixture. We're waiting on the eggs. Oh no, the lemon rind goes in with the sugar and the shortening, and it says to beat them until they're creamy. So got the lemon rind in there with the sugar and the coconut oil, and I'm going to blend that. I have made this recipe many times. It's 2020 now. I've been making this recipe since the late 1980s at least, and I'm thinking that maybe I may even have made it when I was in my kind of baking phase between 1974 and 1977. I did a lot of baking. I guess I continued even into high school. So I'll say 74 to 78. And then when I went to college, I kind of lost interest in it. But that's now creamy. What I was going to say is I've made this recipe many times, and I've probably goofed up on every individual thing that you can goof up in it, and it still comes out all right, usually. But I'm going to give the eggs a little while to heat up and come back to this.